Thank you for joining us for today's Ipsos Ask Us Anything webinar, exploring parenting and TV in the time of the coronavirus. Throughout today's session, you will remain in listen-only mode. However, throughout the webinar, you may submit questions online using the Q&A feature. Time permitting, we'll answer questions at the end of today's session. However, if time runs short, then your question will be answered by email. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be posted to our website within about 48 hours. Okay. Now we're going to likely give you guys a few minutes extra to your day, as we expect to be running just under an hour. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Michael Baer, SVP with our Ipsos Media team. Michael, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and thanks to all the listeners who've joined us today. We certainly hope that all of you and your families and friends and colleagues are remaining healthy and well during this anxious time. I'm really excited about today's session. Not only because I know that the content is great, but in addition, I frankly don't think there's been enough discussion about an audience that I've dubbed the unsung heroes of the lockdown. Well, of course, everyone is going through this truly unprecedented event together. It's the parents who are the most turned upside down by the crisis and the lockdown and shouldering enormous weight every day, fighting through stress and anxiety and exhaustion and juggling a tremendous amount of roles, from being employees to teachers and educators to parents and providers. So in today's webinar, we'll be focusing on the moms and the dads out there in order to provide insights to help brands and media companies better understand and engage with them, and ways to keep them relevant and sensitive and timely. This webinar is part of an ongoing Ipsos Ask Us Anything series. It means that you can submit any question about today's topic during the webinar. You can put it in the chat box, and we will answer all the questions that we have time for, and any question that we're unable to get to during the session, we will respond to via email. So now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today's session. So first we have Mallory Newell. So Mallory is a research director in our Ipsos Public Affairs group in Washington, D.C., where she focuses on public polling for a wide range of media outlets and private sector clients. Today's topic is particularly relevant for her as she's a new mom to her 5-month-old daughter, Charlotte. Mallory will be providing some insight into polling data on parents' attitudes and behaviors during the crisis. We also have Virginia Lennon. She's an SVP with the Ipsos Media Group on the Content and Platform Strategy team. Virginia oversees custom research as well as some audience tracking initiatives amongst kids and family, as well as multicultural population. She's also currently sheltering in place with her family, her husband, her 3 kids, and their dog, Murphy. Virginia will discuss the evolving role of entertainment for parents during the lockdown. And finally, we have Greg Guiazda, who's a vice president in our Behavioral Science Center. Greg has been with Ipsos for nearly 15 years. He's currently holed up with his wife and 2 kids, 10-year-old and a 14-year-old, in Cincinnati, where he says he's been trying to introduce his kids to Seinfeld and James Bond movies. Good job, Greg. Greg will provide input on which behaviors are likely to stick once the epidemic is over and which ones are likely to be short-lived. So with no further ado, I turn things over to our first speaker, Mallory Newell. Mallory, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Michael mentioned, I'm going to be walking through what we're seeing in public opinion lately, how parents are feeling, and how they're adapting in this current environment. I think this discussion is timely for many reasons, but particularly given the New York Times Upshot article that came out today, focusing on the things that lockdown has exposed about working and parenting, and how the virus has really thrust the conflicting demands of work and family life out into the front and center. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what we know so far. First, I think it's important that we recognize that the time we're in is more of a temporary equilibrium. And what I mean by that is after an initial significant worsening of indicators like mental health, emotional well-being, consumer confidence, and panic buying, people's views and emotions have overall kind of generally leveled off. That being said, this point in time certainly isn't without its challenges for people, especially not for parents. A majority of parents say that they miss their old routines, that they're experiencing significant disruption, and that frankly they're frustrated right now. These are not views that are unique to parents by any means. Parents' views here largely match what we're seeing overall. However, I do want to point out that there is a slight difference here in the intensity of some of these feelings. For example, parents are more likely to say that they strongly agree about being frustrated by being cooped up, much more than non-parents, meaning those without a child or children under the age of 18 in their household. However, despite our current circumstances, parents remain mostly confident in the job we're doing, and perhaps some of us that are parents themselves, it may feel kind of striking to look at this slide and see that, 7 in 10 parents overall feel as if they're doing a great job of parenting. I do think it is important to note both the difference here between moms and dads. As you can see, dads tend to be a little bit more confident in their views that they're doing a great job right now. But overall, parents tend to fall into this somewhat agree. So, we feel like we're doing a great job, but there is a little bit of hesitation or just generally a sense that folks are not overwhelmingly confident about the fact of how we're all doing, as parents right now. Now, importantly, and I think this really sets the stage for a lot of the behavioral and attitudinal change that we're seeing here. Despite frustrations, despite a longing for your old routine, no one's really planning to go anywhere anytime soon. So again, if you set aside the feelings of disruption, but also the feeling of just the job that you're doing, parents, like everyone else, are willing to hunker down for as long as it takes. This is something that we've seen across the board with a majority of Americans saying that they're willing to maintain their current self-quarantine or social distancing as long as it takes. And for folks that actually give a time frame, most are saying at least another month, if not another few months. So we're in it for the long haul, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I also want to note that some other polling that my team has done recently shows that most Americans, including parents, feel that it would be a risk to them personally to resume their pre-coronavirus activities right now. And in fact, some polling that we released on Friday, a supermajority, nearly 8 in 10, across all subgroups, so gender, age, parent status, region of the country, everyone is expressing a great deal of caution about returning to social public spaces, say if restrictions were to be lifted tomorrow. So regardless of your personal feelings, regardless of how you're adjusting and adapting, or if you are adapting in this current environment, the sense of keeping yourself and keeping your family safe is still paramount. So in this moment where, we have people acknowledging disruption, have people longing for their old behaviors, but also having a commitment to stay at home, we have to wonder what's next and how parents are feeling about it. And as we can see on this slide, most are, fairly optimistic about the next month. But as you can see here, parents are slightly less optimistic than those without kids at home. So we see that overall, slightly more than half say that they're cautiously optimistic about the next month, and that breaks down to just under 2/3 of without kids at home versus 56% of parents. So again, most of us are cautiously optimistic about what's to come. But those with small children at home or young children at home, perhaps not as forthcoming with that optimism as some others. Now I want to take a moment to look at the challenges and what Ipsos's public polling data shows that parents are facing right now. There's, I think, some unique challenges that all parents are facing, regardless of whether you are working in or out of the home. There is a sense that, there's potential strain that folks are facing right now. We asked in a poll recently, this data came out at the beginning of last week, if coronavirus restrictions or closures were to leave you without income, basically how long could your household be on without any sort of outside assistance? And as we see here, for parents, about half tend to fall into that 1 to 2 months or less range, whereas folks without children at home, are perhaps a little bit more likely to say that they could stick it out for longer, say more than 6 months, as you can see in that teal bar toward the right side. So whether your work status, whatever it is, set that aside for a moment. And I think it's just important to recognize that there is a little bit of a greater sense of financial pressure on parents right now, in the sense that, their household could stay afloat for less time than those without kids at home. But now, I think this is really speaking to the unique challenge that's facing parents right now. And that's how you juggle work and home life, which, as we know, each require undivided attention. This goes back to the crux of that New York Times piece I referred to a couple minutes ago today. Basically, when you have competing priorities, work that requires 100% of your attention, children that require 100% of your attention, and they're suddenly thrust together in one place, how are parents dealing with that? And the answer is not great, not horrible. Like I said, most feel like they're doing a great job of parenting writ large, but it certainly is a challenge. And if you look to the graph on the left, this is a question that we've asked in our Axios Ipsos coronavirus index over time. Just how's your ability to effectively do your job changed? And as we can see here, about half of parents say that their ability to do their job effectively, being the key word, has gotten worse over the past few weeks. And actually, over time, if you look at that teal line, you notice that they're starting to feel a little bit of a easing up among non-parents, with fewer over time saying that their ability to effectively do their job has gotten worse. So parents are certainly feeling that pressure more when it comes to working at home. And then if you look to the right, this is from another poll that we released with the media channel Newsy last week, just asking folks if they agree or disagree on their kids impacting their ability to work. And overall, we have about 4 in 10 parents saying that their kids are impacting their ability to work. So not a majority, but a plurality. But what I find is interesting here, looking at this difference between working moms and working dads. Nearly half of working dads say that their kids are impacting their ability to work. Now, of course, our polling didn't really dig into the why, but if you go back to the article I mentioned today, and frankly vast amounts of other literature on the subject, one can perhaps hypothesize that working mothers might just be more used to these competing demands. But, at the time of a global pandemic, suddenly these competing priorities and demands and juggling a number of things are being thrust on everyone, and folks are feeling the pressure. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that all of our data is bad for parents at the moment. I'm going to keep reminding you, most of us feel like we're still doing a good job, so hold on to that. I know I am. But before I turn it over to Virginia, I do want to share a couple points about adaptation and behavioral change. Now, in spite of sort of longing for our pre-coronavirus life, in spite of being frustrated by being cooped up, there is a sense that folks, 2/3 of Americans overall, but parents especially, are trying to make the best of it. For example, we have nearly 3/4 of parents saying that they're trying to take advantage of the time at home. And again, you see parents in larger numbers strongly agreeing that this is the case for them, much more than non-parents. So there is a sense that, especially those with children at home are really just trying to make the best of the hand that they were dealt and the situation that we are all in. And then in addition to that, one thing that I thought was really interesting as you look through the vast amount of public polling Ipsos has done on coronavirus in the past couple weeks, this one here really stood out to me. The amount of time you spend talking to your family, how has that changed? Are Americans doing that more, about the same, or less? And this is really striking to me. If you look, it's over half of parents say that they have increased the amount of time spent to talking to their family. So as all of a sudden we're forced under one roof together, where under that roof is a workplace, a school, a restaurant, a catch-all place, parents are at least trying to foster some deeper familial connections during this current time. And finally, Ipsos polling shows that some new routines may be emerging, and I'll let Virginia and Greg touch on that from a media standpoint specifically in just a moment. But here you can see that when it comes to how people are adapting and how they're changing their behaviors, parents are more likely than non-parents to say that they've developed new cooking routines, new routines for grocery shopping, maybe getting grocery delivery for the first time, for example, and new routines for grooming and personal care, all of which they hope to continue afterward. So again, I think as we dive into specific media content here and what this means for lasting change for parents, I think it is important to set the table here that parents, those with children in the home, are starting to kind of change their behaviors in little ways and in different ways. And I think that's going to carry over to what Virginia is talking about from a TV lens specifically. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mallory. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I think one thing that we can all relate to, whether we have children or don't have children, is that we're all spending a lot more time watching TV, watching streaming services, listening to podcasts, reading books, any type of content. This is a universal change in the COVID situation. We've seen that with, ratings increases and increases in streaming service subscriptions, or even the time that people spend, or what we're talking about. I know that we have a daily check-in of our whole staff for 15 minutes, and we almost every day are talking about what we're watching, because that's how we're filling the time. And Mallory talked about the different types of routines that are changing in the household. And if there is one group of people who are really hyper impacted by increasing content consumption, it's parents, it's households with kids in them. We talked about earlier this idea that parents feel like they're juggling everything. And how and why and the role of content for these parents has changed quite a bit, and the relationship they have with content. And we did a study in combination with our kids and family product, sort of a quick pulse, to look at content consumption in the time of COVID among parents and their kids. And what we found, we've got a lot of information, and Michael can certainly talk about where to find that after the webinar, but I wanted to talk about a few things today, and really this is probably the slide that encompasses everything. The relationship that parents have with content and with TV is changing because of the situation that we're in. And how they're thinking about it, it's almost like, we heard that it's a lifesaver. It's a lifesaver for a few reasons. One, it's the new daycare provider, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, like how some of those behaviors have changed. And the daycare provider, this isn't going to change, right? So even if we begin to like ease restrictions, most schools are canceled, right, till the end of the year. So this need for content to help from that daycare standpoint is going to continue. It's a way as we bond with a family. You know, Mallory was just talking about parents are taking advantage of spending more time and more family time. I mean, we as a family have spent more time together in the past month and a half, like actually watching TV together or watching movies together or talking than we ever have before. Content's also a way to escape the kids, right? Because at the end of the day, you've been juggling work, you've been juggling kids. You do need some time for yourself. So content is obviously filling that need. And then there's the need to stay informed, which we won't focus on too much today because obviously there's a lot of data out there for news, but we can certainly share that information with you later. So if we think about that first prism, that first sort of new relationship that parents are having in terms of the new daycare, we can see the difference in how kids across all ages are spending more time with content and with content devices. So there's all kinds of activities we asked about, and in terms of like, are your children spending more time doing these things? So across, you know, whether it's preschool kids, whether it's kids 6 to 12 or teens, they're spending more time with content. They're spending more time watching TV. They're spending more time on their tablets. And really, if you think about teens, they're spending time they're spending way more time across all kinds of devices. Like, you know, I mean, TikTok is the thing now, right? So they're spending tons of time on TikTok, watching Tiger King, and more importantly, they're also doing their schooling, right? There's a lot of virtual schooling. So even just that device usage, a lot of that's being driven by having to spend time at online school or doing those type of things. And one of the slides that we don't have here looks at the type of content they're consuming, and there's definitely entertainment content, but there's a lot of educational content too that parents are looking for across these different sources and providers. And the interesting thing about this is, while all parents are having to rely much more on content than they ever did before, the most pronounced increase in sort of pre-COVID, you know, to during COVID that we're seeing where kids are spending more time is with working parents, right? They've got to do it all. They're trying to get their job done. So, you know, we have this quote here from a mom in the study that said, you know, I never let my kids watch TV on the weekdays. So if the schoolwork's done, go for it, right? Because she had things to do, she had work to do. And what's interesting is if you look at the more affluent parents who are in households of 100,000 or plus, have 6 percentage points more likely to say their kids are spending more time with content. If we think about that, this is sort of that group also that pre-COVID, from a lot of studies we know, are much less permissive about content, about screen time, about watching TV, and now they've just had to kind of give themselves that permission to allow their kids to watch content and allow their kids to spend more time, you know, with any kind of device, allow their kids more time out of necessity. So, you know, as Mallory said, people are spending more time together, and content is definitely a source of family bonding, right? We looked at what activities parents are more likely to do with their children during the situation right now, and content is by far the activity they're spending the most time doing. There's a little bit of difference, though, in what moms and dads are doing. So moms are leaning more into sort of fun, you know, watching more streaming service content with their kids, but they're also leaning much more into the educational component of that. So reading books, whether it's on print or digital, where the dads, on the other hand, are spending a little bit more time watching live TV with their kids than they did before. Definitely playing video games, which is really interesting, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But also interestingly, even though it's a small percentage, dads were much more likely to be spending time with their kids on podcasts. So what's really interesting is as you're spending this time, more time with your kids on content, you're looking for more things that you can watch together. You're looking for content that is going to help sort of satisfy needs across all of, you know, the groups in the family. Which leads us to some really interesting data that we saw out of our syndicated product called 360, which looks at streaming services and subscriptions to streaming services. And from the December wave, just before the end of the year, to the March wave, we saw a 13% increase in a driver to subscription, being that it had to be popular with my household. The content has to have family content that my family talked about. It really is going from, like, if you think about it, it's going, and we published a paper on this, it's going from a me to a we sort of scenario, where if you're thinking about subscribing to a service, now it's not just about what you're interested in. That was kind of the primary driver in December. Like, I need to, it might be things that my friends watch or things that I want to watch. Now it's gone to a we scenario. So really it's sort of like, you've got to have Daniel Tiger and Tiger King to satisfy all the needs. And it's something that is also applicable to any kind of content provider, broadcast network, cable network, is you have to think that right now, families are spending more time, particularly in prime time together, right? Because that's the end of the workday. So during the day, they want to know that there's programming that they can trust, that their kids can watch. And then when they're going to sit together, it has to be something that they can all watch together. So thinking about that prime time is really important. I also mentioned about video games, and we really wanted to talk about that in terms of content consumption, because there's just been such, that's been one of the areas during this time where both individuals are spending more time playing video games, but families are spending more time playing video games together and individually. So dads are spending more time, moms are spending more time playing with their kids. They were more like, 24% told us that they had purchased a new console in the past month. 22% purchased a new video game. I mean, it's not a wonder, because Animal Crossing is basically like ubiquitous right now. Everyone's playing it. The Nintendo Switch is like, you basically have to like give up your kid's college fund to get one right now, because they're that difficult to get. And this is really important, and a lot of dads also told us that they're leaning into sort of older games and wanting to introduce their family to older games, which kind of leads us to like this idea of, if they're playing video games, they're escaping as well. You can see where 49% of parents said they themselves are spending more time playing video games just for themselves as an escape. They're much more likely to watch streaming services, go to websites. So the content consumption is it's basically a 24-hour-a-day type of increase in a house with families, because they're watching more themselves, they're watching more together, the kids are watching more themselves. And I'll end on this slide, and then we can kick it over to Greg and to Michael for some questions and things like that. But one of the things that is really interesting that we've seen across different studies, and in this parent study, we also saw the need for comfort. Classic entertainment as that idea of comfort food, that maybe it's not on streaming, but it's also in demand. So this was some data from our Syncesio group, who measures like social listening. And about a week ago, the most requested content on Twitter was Friends. You're looking for that comfort. Shrek is a great example. It was the next most requested content. And that's really, if you think about through the lens of families, Shrek is something like, it's a personal thing for a lot of, millennials to watch themselves. It's comfort, but it's also something to introduce to their kids. And if you even think about Friends, I mean, my 14-year-old watches Friends. It's something that we can watch together, because a whole new generation of people have watched Friends. So even that comfort food isn't just for older people. That comfort food is someone who binged Friends, 2 years ago and is going back to it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael.
You want to click it forward to, I got it. So we have some time for Q&A. And we have a few questions that have been submitted. And the first question is for Greg. And it's a question we're getting from many clients, in fact, most clients, and across all sectors about consumer behavior during the crisis. And that is, in particular, specifically to hear what behaviors that we're seeing in response to the crisis, the coronavirus, and the lockdown are likely to stick moving forward, which ones are going to endure, and then which ones are more likely to go away. And we have Greg here from the Behavioral Science Center to give us some perspective. Oh, you're on mute, Greg. Greg?
We can't hear you.
Sorry, you couldn't hear me at all, could you?
No.
That is correct.
I hit the wrong button. So sorry, it's my we'll talk about technology barriers in a second. So, anyways, all right. So, working from home. So yeah. So again, it's a $1 million question. So as we talk about what behaviors are likely to stick, we're really talking about habit change. And there's a lot of work on the psychology of habits. And what's interesting from a behavioral science standpoint, in some ways, I think focusing on the behavior is the last thing we want to focus on. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So we know for habits to change, largely two things need to occur. You need to have an intention and a motivation, and then you need to have a cue or a trigger that activates that behavior. And so as you think about what are likely to change, I think don't so much ask about just behaviors themselves. Ask about how the intentions around them are changing, and are the cues around them likely to stick? Are they likely to endure? And so it's an example of that. We know that habits are especially likely to occur when they are embedded, or you might hear this word, piggybacked onto an existing habit. So a routine that you already have is one that's really nice to trying to create a new habit. Something that already exists. If you want to get your kids to wash their face, have them do it right after they brush their teeth. And so think about the habits that we're driving now, and think about when people are using media. So if you are, watching TV, like the woman in the quote who said, my kids get done with their homework, go have at it. If you're watching TV now at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that is a cue that's unlikely to exist in this post, when we go back to the quote-unquote new normal, because that's not there. But if you are consuming media, let's say during dinner, where you didn't do, I know my family and I are doing that a bit. We're exhausted. We're more couch dinnering than before. That is a habit that's going to be more likely to occur. If you are now watching TV after Sunday morning coffee, which you didn't do before, that can happen. So I think as you think about the habits, that are likely, or the behaviors likely to change, don't just focus on the behaviors. Think about the cues, and think about not just what people are doing, but I think that's often overlooked from a psychology standpoint is when they're doing them and where they're doing them. And then from the intention side, that kind of gets at motivation. That definitely is a component of that. I would look at not necessarily what the motivations are, but what are the barriers that are being knocked down. And so, again, having all of us having young kids, the barriers, they know how to use the technology. So think about when some of these are going out there, I think it's the older generation, not necessarily media, but my 80-year-old parents are asking me about Zoom. And so I never thought that would happen. And so I think you're going to see as the new subscriptions, Virginia said, are being added, people are going to figure out how to stream those to their TV. They're going to figure out how to learn those. When we are engaging in new behaviors that are knocking down barriers that we hadn't thought about, those are the ones that are likely to stick. So I think it's those are the two things I would think about as you think about what's likely to retain, and you think about your own brands and outlets.
Thank you. Interesting. Next question is for Mallory. So what does your data say about parents' current mental health and emotional well-being? Are there any differences between moms and dads, or those that are working from home and those who aren't?
That's a great question, Michael. Like I said, it's an interesting time for everyone, not just parents. As our data shows, parents are certainly feeling emotions at both ends of the spectrum simultaneously. Work is hard. There's a longing for pre-COVID life, for pre-COVID routines, but they're especially trying to make the best of it and perhaps kind of start to foster these deeper connections that maybe, as Greg pointed out, could last after this quarantine period is over. So with that in mind, right now what our polling shows is that slightly more than 1 in 3 parents, somewhere in the 35 to 40% range, say that their mental health as well as their emotional well-being have gotten worse in the past week. And that's slightly more than non-parents. This is something that we've actually been tracking over the past 7 weeks or so with Axios. And going back to a phrase that I used at the beginning of my presentation of a temporary equilibrium, I think basically what we've seen with parents is that right after people started sheltering in place in large numbers. So go back to early to mid-March. There was an initial significant worsening of people's mental health, of people's emotional well-being. But since then, emotions really haven't changed that much. And so this is sort of our new status quo. But if you look at our most recent data, so what was released a week ago, I do see a little bit of a difference when you look at moms versus dads. Moms are more likely to report worsening emotional well-being, to report worsening mental health compared to dads. Now, interestingly, though, they're also less likely to say that their kids are impacting their ability to work. So perhaps it's a question of sort of shouldering more burden outside of the work zone. Perhaps it's just taking on more. We don't know. But there is a little bit of a gap there between moms and dads in terms of how they're doing, and not just asking people, how are you, but how are you really doing? And the last thing I'll note, as far as work status, and I'm talking overall now, not just for parents, people who are working from home, and that's something that's changed in the past couple of weeks, generally report a worsening emotional well-being compared to those that aren't working from home. It's a really small group as well, but those that have been laid off recently, not surprisingly, their mental health, their well-being is worse across the board compared to all other groups.
You know, it's interesting, Valerie, in our study, we saw something similar with dads and moms, where dads were much more concerned on a top box level of how they were going to get everything done. Like, how am I going to work at home and have the kids here? How am I going to possibly homeschool the kids? How am I going to do all? They were definitely much more concerned. And we kind of, I think we talked about it, hypothesized sort of the same thing, that, moms were also concerned. So it wasn't that they weren't, but it was to a lesser degree. And so I think it is a bit because they're doing that a little bit more, right? So, dads kind of find out how hard it is to, actually do it all. So that was interesting. We saw that as well.
Thank you. And this next one's for Virginia as well. So what are some things that media companies can do to help parents not regret the additional screen time they're being forced to allow for their children?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, we talk about, like, don't, this is, with everything that's going on, content has filled a real need for parents. And, as I mentioned, think about it like a relationship. The relationship has changed. So, your commitment to parents and to looking at parents through all the different prisms of how they are using content is going to be really important for them not to regret it, right? Like my kid, my kid's brain didn't melt because I let him watch 2 more hours of TV a week than I usually do, right? That's really what we're going to have to communicate. And there's a few ways I think you can do that. Number one is remember that right now, sort of TV time is family time. Particularly in those primetime hours where for a long time, cable network, TV networks, yes, there's some family programming, but it's been more focused on the me, right, on what an adult watches than necessarily what the families combined watch. And, I mean, you're seeing some changes in that, right? You've seen the Disney sing-alongs, and you've seen some different things in prime time that are great, some more game shows. So definitely think about that prime time right now. The families gathered around the TV again. So be more conscious of that viewing, be conscious. And this is an opportunity to, to either develop, content that meets that need moving forward, because hopefully some of that behavior is going to stick. The other thing I think is that you might want to do is even in that prime time, listen, parents kind of know when their favorite show is on for the most part, right? There isn't, there's not a lot of new shows launching. or if you're launching a new show, whether it's on the algorithm on a platform or whether you're promoting on air, promote some of these family shows to kids. Take that opportunity to highlight when you have family and kid-friendly programs that can help them, not just like to watch together, but during the working hours, right? So it's a great opportunity for channels and networks that provide content for kids all the time. Find ways to sort of cross, through either your sister channels to kind of highlight, hey, there's some really great programming that, that doubles as, edutainment that you can put your kids. Get your dads excited. Dads are using more live TV right now. They're playing more videos. They're spending more time with their kids watching content. So, something that really thinks about it through the dad prism is probably important. And then, the one piece of content that kids are watching the most that we didn't highlight here is movies. So it's a real opportunity, and particularly with their family. So it's an opportunity to kind of bring the theater home and make sure that the kids are, and that there's, if you consider an early platform release, look how well, of all the kind of early platform releases, the ones that have really fared the best tend to be the ones that are more family focused, like the, Trolls Return or Trolls 2 had a great success. So I think that's how I probably think about it in terms of recommendations for media and content providers.
Thank you. And this is back to Greg. It's kind of along the same tack and maybe some of the things you've already mentioned. But the question is, given that parents are relying on TV now to be their babysitters, forcing parents to be more screen permissive, do they foresee restricting screen time again once things go back to normal, or will they continue to relax their rules regarding screens?
Yeah, no, it is very much, it dovetails nicely to what I said before as well as to what Virginia was just talking about. So I think it goes into, as we talk about, the habits again and the cues and things like that, and I think so much of the cues are context related, or we think about, can even be psychological. So I think like a lot of the cues that are driving our behaviors right now are things like, boredom. And I think that is a target that's going to go away. And I think, and I've kind of alluded to this before, but context, are we alone versus social situations and things like that? Time of day are things that are there. So I think, in some ways, I was also a little jealous, Virginia said 2 hours more a week. I thought she was going to say a day, but I guess I'm one of those great dads who will let way too much TV go. But I think if you're doing that in the middle of the day, those situations aren't likely to be cued. And so I think, parents can alleviate themselves with some of the guilt because a lot of this is going to change. But Virginia also raised on a really nice thing. The end point of the habits loop is it's a cue and behavior, then the reward, what do you get from it? And I think, we can instill certain types of rewards. I think the rewards the kids are getting, that we worry about as a parent are like, the crazy YouTube channels, and Lord knows what, I want to go in, I won't get on my soapbox on that, on some of the things that are there. But, like if you can limit back to family time, you can create new rewards in a way that I think we all want. And I think that's one of the benefits that's happened lately is for a lot of us have been able to see that family bond. So I think, parents can alleviate some of their guilt. That said, we all know kids have strong behaviors, and the little lawyers, there's still going to be a tug of war. I'm not naive.
Well, listen, I fell off the visual, but I'm still on the audio. But I will say I meant 2 hours more a week because I was talking about those super restrictive parents, you know what I mean, where they really restrict their kids, viewership. So, the 2 hours, but I mean, in my household, it's like, I don't know, 5 hours more a day or something. So
it's Lord of the Flies over here in Ohio.
I think Mallory, that point about trying to assuage guilt, just if I can jump in quickly here, we have some public data that shows that as well. We asked, how are you feeling in that same list of questions? Do you feel like you're currently doing a great job? And a majority of parents right now say that they feel as if they're not doing enough activities with their children compared to other parents. Something that I thought was really interesting, you have a panel of parents right here who are maybe identifying with some of these data points more than others, but I think that's an important point as we look to content consumption and lessons that can be learned is, now is not the time where we need to be putting pressure on ourselves. And, it's okay, you're doing a great job, and you don't necessarily need to feel like you have to do the most activities or compare to what other parents are doing. So I just wanted to chime in and note that, since we have some data that kind of speaks to that level of parental guilt right now.
But that does highlight a potential opportunity for media companies and content providers to potentially provide those opportunities for activities for families to participate in.
Yeah.
And that's a nice segue into the next question we got for Virginia, actually. What types of content do people want? What are they watching more of now?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we're trying to track that as well. We have a syndicated product called TV Dailies, where we have some COVID-specific questions, and some of it is around content and content choices. Listen, everybody right now, when you ask them about content, there's some things that everybody wants. Like, everybody wants to be entertained, right? Everybody wants to be informed, right? Those are two important things right now, right? That's like the two sides of the coin. I want entertainment, and we've seen news consumption go up. There are some differences, interestingly enough, around increases in like wanting family-friendly content, again, across the board. But you do find households with kids, as you'd expect. But even within those households with kids, you see higher income households, and then also multicultural populations are also wanting more of that. And it makes sense, right? There's more kids in the household, so that idea of having more content for kids. But if we think about, like, what do people want to watch, we have to also sort of think about need states, right? Because, we're in this sheltering, this shelter in place, need states can change a little bit, or how we think about things, right? So, there's a huge need to escape. There's a need for comfort. We talked about that earlier. So there's all these kind of different need states that are driving what people are watching at any one point. But interestingly, the really interesting thing about need states, I'd be interested also to see what Greg thinks about this, but is that, the idea of, like, let's take the need state escape. So I say I want to escape, my next door neighbor says she wants to escape, but I might do it, my escape might be like, I don't know, watching, some old episode of The Bachelor or something, where her idea of escape is like watching a doomsday movie, right? It helps her, like, escape the real reality. Or somehow that's a comfort, that's something to comfort, where for me, comfort is watching, Pride and Prejudice for the 17th time, where hers is watching a doomsday movie because it's making her feel not so bad about the current situation. So there's all kinds of, or, people are watching Tiger King to be comforted because, that you can say, oh my gosh, my life is not as bad as those people. So there's all kinds of different needs and need states, but how those are being manifested can be very different. So the point is, you want variety. You want to be able to lean into your content library. You want to be able to offer different types of content. And as we think about parents, as I said, again, think about parents through sort of those four prisms of how they're talking about content right now and how they're dealing with content right now. But Greg, I'd be interested to see if you have any thoughts on these states. Yeah.
I mean, and build. Yeah, I mean, agree with everything, and simply to build the, we know in these times of uncertainty from an emotional standpoint, people are seeking control, and I think one way that people can get control is through that familiarity. So, they want to know what's there, and so I think, I know you're giving examples, I think, more people are going to want to rewatch Pride and Prejudice than, like, go into those dystopian futures. But I think, it's that familiarity, that comfort. But I think you're right. So I think you can, if you want to offer up something that's new, not necessarily that's completely new, but, if you can, it may seem like an oxymoron, but new but familiar. And so I think of, like, anecdotally, like my wife has been streaming the new Fiona Apple album all left and right because it reminds her of college. I think, we've been watching Phineas and Ferb. So, and things like that, that my 14-year-old who would never have watched that, I think, is there. Or, like, I'm excited about the Michael Jordan documentary. But I think those have elements of familiarity with that. And I think the Tiger King is fascinating because I think it was so big almost before this that people kind of know what they're getting into in the absurdity. It takes away, it gives you that escapism without some of the risk. And then I think you're absolutely right with social connectedness. What are things that you can bond over with, internally within your house or across social media? So I think those, yeah, that sense of familiar but new is something I would think about as you're going out there. Something that's completely new might be a little unsettling at the aggregate.
So I think we've got time for one more. Back to Virginia, question about advertising and brands. So how about advertising? Do parents welcome ads and brands into the viewing experience? And if so, how can brands do it right?
Yeah, actually, we did ask about that in the study, and again, we're happy to share the full deck. Michael can be our curator for that. But we did find that actually parents are open to advertising and are more open to it than non-parents in our study. 70% of parents said that they were receptive, and that was 1.27 times more than non-parents. But, right, there's a but to this. Brands really need to be thoughtful with their messaging and sort of give more than they're taking. So you're already sort of seeing this, right? You're seeing brands that are trying to explain how they're helping during the crisis. That was more important to parents than non-parents. Something that was really important to parents was, they said they were more likely to buy from a company if they did right by their employees in this difficult time. So it wasn't just, what are you doing for me? It was that sort of shared idea of that you're taking care of the people that work for you, because parents themselves, and probably Mallory has data on that, people are nervous. And people are scared of sort of their own job. And so they're kind of projecting that onto brands as well, if you think about it. So they're definitely open to it, but you want to avoid, bad advertising, right? You want to do it responsibly, and it's kind of a balancing act to play. So you definitely have to acknowledge the crisis. There was a quote, we have a quote from a dad who said, listen, I'm still buying things, so sure, advertise to me, but I don't think you can just put your ad from 6 months ago on TV, if it doesn't feel right anymore, right? The way that I'm buying your product and why I'm buying your product may have changed. So you want to acknowledge that crisis, not just from the standpoint of how we're all collectively dealing with the uncertainty, but also acknowledge where your brand fits in there and how you can help families and how you can help parents. You also want to consider your audience, because some regions might be a little bit different in how much they want to hear that kind of reception. And most of all, you need to be helpful and you need to be authentic, because parents, just like with content, they're looking for brands to help in the crisis, right? I would say you want to have messaging that really matches perceptions about your brand, but also tells parents how your brand or how your product can help them.
Great, thanks. I think we're out of time. We'll stop here. We've had some great questions. We've got a few more which we'll answer via email. I want to thank all of you for listening in, and I want to especially thank the panelists. Thank you, Mallory, Greg, and Virginia. Thanks again. Stay well, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.